Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Freer Home. My name is Jenny Marquette, and I'm the Executive Director of the Ashland County Historical Society. You are in the Freer Home out here, part of our renovation project from the county. So about 3 or 4 years ago, the Historical Society obtained this particular building from the county, and we have been in the business of restoring it over the last few years. We got a grant from the state of Ohio, and we kind of have the first floor finished, and now we're working on the second floor. So we look forward to having a lot more things like this. When we get the second floor done, much of our natural history museum will be going upstairs, where we have some very nice large display rooms. So we're hoping that Jim Bennett, who is our speaker tonight from Premier Auctions, will be able to tell us about some of the things that we already have. And he has brought some things with him tonight that he is going to share with us that are ancient American artifacts. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jim. If during the presentation anytime you'd like to jump back there and grab a cookie or a cup of coffee or some water or some punch, feel free. We're kind of interactive here. Not Jim though, he has to talk. But feel free to help yourselves back there. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Jim.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Well, I'm going to use the microphone as they're recording this. If I sit down on and off, my back's going to give me a little bit of grief today. So the girls in the office made me move something, and it reminded me of manual labor, and it didn't like it. I've given a lot of different talks over the years around the country, and everything is usually on a specific topic. It's about artifact authentication, it's about the timelines and the paleo period, or it's about specific artifacts. I love giving talks like this because we're talking about everything tonight. We're going to talk about artifacts and timelines and how man entered the United States, how they wound up in Ashland, what they used, and why they used them. So we find a lot of artifacts around Ashland County and in Ohio. Has anybody here found an artifact, an arrowhead or anything in the field? Yeah. Well, it's funny because I found, this is my first point, okay? Right here, it's my first arrowhead. I found that when I was 22 years old. And I was living up in Polk, and I was walking across a field after deer hunting, and it was in the fall, and I bent down to tie my shoelace, and as I was doing that, in a cornfield, there was that arrowhead laying there, and I'd never found an arrowhead in my life. And I grew up in the country, Medina, and then Polk. And I looked down and thought, well, that's an arrowhead. And the first thing that happened was immediately, why is it here? Who was the last person to touch this? This has not been touched in hundreds of years. And your mind starts thinking about the people that made it and wondering, was he hunting? Why did he lose it? How did he lose it there? And of course, what tribe is it from? Because that's the first question you find an arrowhead is, I wonder what tribe. Well, I went back deer hunting the next day with my buddy, and we never got the tree stand. We kind of put the bows against the tree and started walking that cornfield, and we found a few more arrowheads. And that was the start of a long 35 years of a lot of fun that's taken me in directions that I never knew existed. I once wrote a magazine article for Indian Artifact magazine about this piece, and I call it The Point That Changed My Life. And it really has been. Because of this here, I've spent the last 35 years traveling all over the country dealing with ancient artifacts, and it's just been a great journey. So I'm really pleased to be able to share some of that with you, and I appreciate you showing up. I know it's a cold night here in Ohio, but what better to do than go talk about old pointy rocks, right? So here's what we've got. I know some of you I've met before, and some are customers or collectors that I've known for a long time. I'm going to start at the basics, and if it's stuff you already know, I'll apologize. But first off, most arrowheads aren't arrowheads, okay? And they weren't made by any tribe. So that's the most interesting thing I learned my first day I started researching arrowheads. Only probably 10% of arrowheads are ever used on a bow and arrow. And out of that, unless you're in the Columbia River region, the Snake River, Mandan tribes, the tribes weren't making them out of flint, they're trading for steel. These are ancient artifacts, meaning ancient meaning prehistoric, meaning it predates history. So this is before, we're going backwards, way before contact with the Europeans. In order to start that journey, we're going to go back 15,000 years to when people entered North America, because they ended up in Ashland. So how did they get to Ashland? The ancient timeline is divided into time periods. You have the Paleolithic period, which is the oldest, and then the Archaic, and then the Woodland, and then the Mississippian, and then the Protohistoric, and then the Historic. The Historic being when European contact was made. When you go back to the first people in Ohio and in Ashland, it's during the Paleolithic period. And this is where you have nomadic bands of people that they don't have big village life. They're not hunters and gatherers. They're traveling and they're following herd animals. And they're traveling a lot of megafauna, the big animals that are now extinct. Woolly mammoths, there's a bunch of them. But anyways, they were following these herds. Ohio had elk up until, I think, 1908 was the last elk that was seen in Ohio. So we had actually herds of elk. There were herds of buffalo in Ohio that would come through, Ohio and Kentucky. So they're following herds of animals as they move. Now, when you go back to how did they get here? So how did these first people actually get here? Man entered the original theory, or the main theory right now, is the Berengia Theory, which says that during the last glaciation period, which was the Wisconsin glaciation period, there was these big ice sheets and it sucked up all the water, and when it did that, it dropped all the sea levels down, and there ended up with the Bering Sea, ended up with a land bridge. And they're saying that there was there's a corridor between two of the main ice sheets, and those ice sheets were the Cordillera and Laurentide, and between there is this big corridor, and they say man came through there and then spread across all of America, which is a real good theory, and it's possible that it happened. It's probably probable that some people did. But then, as they do more archaeology and excavations, they're learning that also there's the coastal migration theory. There's a good chance that people came by water or down along the coast of California from the Aleutian Islands and around that way. And then you get a site called Monteverde down in southern Chile, which is really far away from this land bridge up there at the Bering Sea. And now they're carbon dating, and they're getting dates of 16,000 to 17,000 BC. They're saying, well, how did man get from there to there that fast? So now it's even more confused. And then DNA comes along, and they start DNA testing indigenous people, and they're like, well, this group has got Polynesian DNA, so is that another? So it ends up with what they have called the multiple migration theory, meaning that people probably came from many different areas for a long time, and it ended up here. Okay, now, once they're here, the Paleo people were following their herds, and they were in Ohio. There was, if you look at Ashland County, what I love about Ashland County is a great example of the glacier, because the northern half of Ashland County is flat as a pancake. And then you get to where it's all hilly, and you're like, well, why is this? Well, because the glacier actually split right across Ashland County. Now, they would travel south or away from the glaciers, but they would follow, up to it. But there was Paleo people up in here, but not as many as were in southern Ohio, Tennessee, Kentucky, and out west. But the Paleo people were here, and what happened was, at some point in time, there's more people, and now they're starting to settle down a little bit. They're not doing the nomadic herds, now they're settling into village life. This starts kind of a new time period, which is the Archaic, which is the period of hunters and gatherers. Now, instead of traveling nomadically, they're saying, we're just going to stay here in Mohicanville and pitch our little lodges and stick around here for a few months or a season or a year or until we deplete the area, and then we'll move on somewhere else. And they would hunt the local game. They would gather nuts and berries and roots, and that was their lifestyle. They weren't farming, and they were no longer nomadically hunting the herds. And this went on for a very long period of time. The Archaic period spans a long time. And you get into the Woodland period, which is the next period. Well, now you've got more and more and more and more people, and instead of just village life, now you're getting into more organized structure. Now you're getting into governmental structure. You have a little bit of hierarchy there, and you're getting into some religious beliefs, ceremonies. They're just progressing. They're just progressing, and bigger villages, and the technology along the way is increasing also. Okay. Once you come through, you get into the Woodland. Ashland County and this part of Ohio has a huge history with that period, because while there was paleo here and there was archaic people here, the Woodland people left a lot of evidence. Mounds. There's a lot of mounds and not fortifications yet, but there's a lot of mounds. The Serpent Mound in southern Ohio, there's hundreds and hundreds of mounds in Ohio. And they were used for burying their dead, they were used for ceremonies. But those were the mound builders, the Adena and the Hopewell, and they were very prevalent here. After the mound builders, we move into the Mississippian period, and now you've got even more and more and more and more people. But now what happens is you have farming, and you've got pottery, which probably started in Woodland, but now you have pottery. And the interesting thing with farming and pottery is that now you have food stores. And I've had a lot of good debates with anthropologists on this, and I've agree with them on this one. All of a sudden, you're getting places that are having fortifications. You're like, why do we have fortifications? We really didn't have fortifications being built prior to this. But once farming got here, your crop died and went bad because you got a hailstorm. My people are starving, I'm taking yours. Because now you have stored food, where before you didn't have stored food. And I think that was one of the big changes where you start seeing the fortifications and more, or less happy interaction between people. But so that's basically the periods. The Mississippian period goes into basically when, or almost right up to when, European contact was made. Now, when European contact was made, they're estimating, there's estimates all over the board on this, but the one that I see most frequently published in the journals and stuff is 80 million people. Okay? Some will say 20 to 80, who knows? Let's say there's 80 million people. Once the Spanish got here, they're talking about a 60 to 80% wipeout of the entire population. Okay? Smallpox, cholera, especially smallpox, cholera, all the diseases that they brought with them. And these big societies that were here, big cities, nice cities, big villages, they got wiped out, they got displaced, they moved, and that literally is what turned into the modern tribes of today, okay? And they've been pushed around and shuffled around. But mainly, in the prehistoric timeline, everything was made out of what they had. There was no European metal. There was no metalworking in the United States except for one small time period, which we'll talk about. But everything was made with what you had. You had bone, antler, wood, animal parts, bladders. They used everything. Okay. You've got plants and plant fibers. You have stone and you have flint. And this is what they had available to make all their tools and equipment with. So we're going to run through a few things here real quick. When you look at the toolkit of prehistoric man, and you have your arrowheads or projectile points, and you have knives, and you have drills, and you have hoes, you have chopping tools, you have axes, you have everything that we have today. It's just different because they made it with what they had. One of my favorite examples of this is this. This is a few hundred years old. It's not from Ohio. This is an ulu. It's the most common knife in Alaska that the Inuits use. Okay, this is you'll find these up to probably about 2,000 years old up in that area. Okay, that's an ulu. Here's the same knife made today. The technology is the same. It's a sharp blade with a handle. That's all you needed. A stone axe. That's an axe. It was grooved. It was hafted, and it was used for chopping. It's no different than our axes today. It's just made out of the material that they had available at the time. Grinding. It's a grinding pestle used for grinding corn, nuts, whatever. This is what they used to grind. Farming. We use hoes. We dig with spades and shovels. This is theirs. This is a stone hoe or a spade. It would have been hafted like this on a stick, and that's how it was used. And that's what they did their farming with. If you're making something out of wood, you need a chisel or a gouge. That's a gouge. Same thing. It's 2,500 years old, but it's the same basic tool that we use today. If you're drilling holes in wood or bone back then, you use a drill. Only it's made out of flint, and it's attached to a wood handle. Same tools, different materials. So this arrowhead that I found, unfortunately it's not an arrowhead, it's an Edina culture, which is the Woodland period. It actually predates the invention of the bow and arrow, they believe, in Ohio. They think that the bow and arrow came into use here around 100 AD. Okay, so for 10,000 or 12,000 years, what were they using if they didn't have a bow and arrow? So what they were using was an atlatl. And I'm going to have to put the mic down to show this, but this is an atlatl that they believe came into existence sometime during the late Paleo or transitional period. And it's been used by the Aztecs, the Incas, it's everywhere is the use of an atlatl. And this is how it works. I'm not going to throw it. This is called an atlatl dart. It's this long. This is the dart point. Usually these are components, they're two pieces that fit together. Okay, so you've got this and this. Rather than carrying 30 of these with you or 20 of them hunting, you carry one or two of these and a whole bunch of these in a satchel, so when you missed and broke it, you take another one out and you can put it on. Also, it's believed that when it would drive in from the inertia, it would kick the shaft back out. I've read different reports on that. I'm not real proficient with this, but this is an atlatl. This is an atlatl dart. This is an atlatl. On here you have a handle, shaft, the hook, which is usually an antler tip or bone, and a stone weight. And what this does is this extends your arm. So if I take this spear and I throw it, I'm going to throw it maybe 25% of the distance that I can throw it with an atlatl. So this atlatl, it goes like this. Oops. This hooks into this end right here. You knock it, you hold it like so, and when you throw it, it's going a lot farther, but more than that, it's got a lot more impact and a lot more knockdown power, a lot more penetration. So what's interesting about it, this is designed really close. There's a friend of mine who's an archaeologist out in Montana that designed this, and it's really closely fashioned off of one that he had studied. What's interesting is this kind of went out of use once the bow and arrow became the most prevalent and we had smaller game that we were hunting. The atlatl was replaced by the bow and arrow. But in 1910, which is the date of this atlatl, okay, they're still using these. This is Australian, Aboriginal. It's identical science to ours. There's a hook on the end. It's made out of local materials. And they have a spear, and this is what they use. And we're continents apart. So the technology is interesting to me how it overlaps. So now moving on from there.
Jen?
Yes?
So like what kind of animals were they spearing with that? Like
with that, let's start with probably woolly mammoth,
okay.
Mastodons, and there was buffalo antiquus, or however you say it. It's the bigger buffalo. There were a lot of the larger animals, but they were also using that on deer. The guys that were really good, it wouldn't surprise me if they were getting rabbits with them. I'm lucky to hit the side of a barn. I love throwing it, it's fun. We'll have groups come out and with the Boy Scouts and that, and we'll go behind our business and sit back there. It's fun. But they were about everything that we're using it today as far as larger animals. They were hunting with it very accurately. They still have groups now that do Atlatl championships and associations, and they target. It's amazing how close they can center at 30 yards or 40 yards away with one of those. So, good question. So we go back to making. We talk about making the tools. How do they make these tools? So they have, here they are, they're back then, they've got their bone, their stones, and their animal parts. And how are they actually shaping and making what they needed to make? We'll start with stone, okay? To make a stone, you need another stone. So this is a hammer stone. Some of them are round, some of them like this one are grooved and had a hammer-like handle on it, okay? Basically, if you take this stone and hit another stone, it's going to knock off a peck. And it's a process called pecking. And what you do is you just sit there, you just keep beating on that until you get it to the shape that you want it. Okay? And once it gets close, then you can go ahead and smooth it down using sand, fat, tallow, some kind of medium, and polish it until it's smooth, probably with leather. Now, a lot of these tools, when they got exhausted, in other words, this gets dull, you repeck it, and you resharpen it, and until it gets smaller and smaller and smaller, okay? Until it gets so small that then you turn it into a hammerstone, and you use it for that until you're totally done with it. This, on this Atlatl, is a weight, okay? It's a weight for the Atlatl, which just helps with the distance and the impact. There's a lot of names for these, okay, but Atlatl weight's the best, but there's different types of Atlatl weights. One is a banner stone. This is from Ohio. Find these in the fields. This is a banner stone made out of glacial slate, which is one of Ashland County's favorite materials to use for different items. This is a utilitarian weight, meaning that it's got some damage on it. It was made to be used on an Atlatl. This is another one. It's got the hole in it to go on the Atlatl. There's no way you could use this thing on a working Atlatl. But there are some really exotic, wild banner stones that were made for weights on that. And there's a lot of speculation, which was so much fun about prehistory, is you get to decide what you want to believe because it's not all written down. This is made from banded slate, the same material. It's believed that these are ceremonial or presentation, a sign of status. Some people think maybe they're actually just inserted onto a shaft as a talisman or on the chief marker, okay? But that gives you an idea of the society's having status. Someone has more status, so they've moved into that during the Archaic period. But these here, being banded slate, the first thing you do is you go out and you get a big hunk of slate, and you get your hammer stone, and probably a big rock just to bang with. You start out by making a blank. This is a preform, or a blank, of that. It was just never finished. It was abandoned for whatever reason. But this would have turned into this a few hundred hours later, or 100, whatever it takes. So, but that's what they would do, is they would take these and they would shape the rocks with their toolkit. Now, drilling, you notice that banner stone had a hole in it. Well, there's two ways that they would drill stone. They would drill it with a flint drill, especially if it's slate. Most times they use a flint drill. But if you're working with hard stone, like this one, this is a real hard, dense material. The item they used to drill this was hollow, and it left a peg at the inside. What they would use is they would use cane, and there's a lot of cane around. They would use cane. Some people think they use bone. We tried that. It doesn't work at all. But the cane, what they would do is hollow, and they would spin it, and they would probably use a little sand, a little water as a medium, and they would spin it and spin it and spin it, and it just keeps carving out until they get through. And again, they must have, they didn't have any choice. I'd say they had time on their hand, they had no choice. That was the technology of the day. So before you go take a look, and it's kind of neat. But that's how they would drill their items. They would use the flint drills on softer materials, and they would use cane drilling on the harder ones. Now these are flint drilled. These are this is a pendant made out of glacial slate. Ohio is one of literally more pendants, which are Adena, Hopewell, come out of Ohio than about any other state there is. It's just a regional woodland period ornament. And again, they come in a lot of different shapes and sizes. All of them are very similar in type though. So this is a trapezoidal pendant. We had one collection we just auctioned off that had about 900 of these. And that's just one collection, just to give you an idea of how many of these were actually made back in the Hopewell times and the Adena times. But this was drilled with a flint drill, just like that. This is a gorget. It's got 2 holes in it. These were worn this way. And one hole means one hole is a pendant, 2 holes is a gorget. But anyway, so the gorget is just another ornament. These are found in fields. Now these were picked up for years and years and years. Now you find pieces parts because of the farming and cultivators and the no-till. But when they first started farming back in the 17 and 1800s, they were turning these things up by the bushels. Same with the arrowheads. And that's how a lot of the big collections got started. It's interesting that during the early 1900s, when the collecting really got big, late 1800s, early 1900s, the biggest collectors were doctors, and they would trade for artifacts from people that they were visiting. And I always found that to be interesting. Flint Artifacts. So we'll take this piece here. So most arrowheads are not arrowheads. If they're smaller, they're probably used as a dart point on an Atlatl dart. Okay? As soon as you get more than about 1.5 inches long, you're not going to be throwing that anywhere because it's going to be too heavy and it's not going to work right. So what you find out is that most arrowheads like this are really knives. This was probably a knife, probably about 4 inches long when it first started out. And what happened was, this thing is totally exhausted, meaning it's been resharpened to the point you can't use it anymore. A knife gets inserted into a handle. So this would have had a wood or bone handle. They would have tied it here. As it got dull, they would re-chip it along the edges to get a sharp cutting edge. Each time they do that, it reduces the length, it reduces the width. It gets smaller and smaller and smaller to get to the point to where it's time to take it out of the handle and put a new one in and start over again. And they would resharpen as much as they can because hafting was quite the chore. So most arrowheads are really knives. And the ones that aren't knives are really Atlatl points. There are arrowheads that are found that are mostly triangular in shape in this area, and some smaller what we call bird points that are notched. But again, it's probably maybe 10% of the amount of flint that you're actually finding out there. So, how are we doing so far? Is everybody sleeping yet? Not yet? Doing okay? Okay. We talked about bone. This is actually Mandan, which is from the Missouri River, okay, area. But it was such a really good example because I know that we talk about using bone. This is antler. This is elk antler, and this is a hide scraper. So when you have a hide, first thing you got to do is you got to scrape all the fat off of it, otherwise it's going to rot away. And you're going to salt it or dry it, however you dry it. But this is actually a tool that they made a lot of scrapers out of antler and bones. And I think in Ohio, a lot of the tools that were made out of bone and antler have rotted away because our environment is not really conducive for what they call perishable items, which is things that rot away. Stuff made out of organic matter rots real fast in Ohio. So that's why you always find the arrowheads, but not the arrow. You find the knife, but not the handle. Unless you're in a rock shelter, a dry cave, and it's sitting on a ledge, which happens a lot in Kentucky. They hunt a lot of the shelters and caves, and they come up with things that are still attached to the handles and other perishable parts to it. This is just an example of the pottery. This is the type of pottery that they use for their daily use. And that's probably going in the Mississippian period. Why didn't they use metal? I mean, you've got all over the world, man, you got the Bronze Age, you got the Iron Age, you got everybody using metal thousands and thousands of years, back to 8,000 years ago, they're using metals. Yet in the United States or in North America, there's not much use of metals. And no one really knows. They just never developed the technology for it. Now there was two times that metals were used. One is called the Old Copper Culture, which is going back into BC times. And the Old Copper Culture is basically Michigan and Wisconsin, and they have what they call float copper, which is natural copper. And they would fashion and form those by pounding. This is an example of a spear point. It's a socketed spear point that's made out of native copper out of Michigan. But it was never melted. They didn't use molds, they didn't melt it, they didn't heat it. They would just bang it into shape. And then they stopped using it. They used it for maybe 1,000 years and then just abandoned it. But then the Hopewell used some copper. The Hopewell culture in Ross and Scioto County, Ohio, they found copper artifacts, and in Indiana they found some. So they picked it up again, but again, while there's still some debate on if they ever smelted it or melted it or used molds, you know, archaeologists go back and forth on that. They're the professionals, all of them figured out. I really don't know. But it never took off as an industry up until once you had European contact. The first thing that happens is trade goods. We want furs. You're in the fur trade era. You've got the French and the Spanish and the English, and everyone's trying to get the Indians to trade with them. And now the Indians realize that the steel and the iron is so much superior to the stone and the knives and made out of flint. So they switched to it. Well, these are just a couple period times. These are 1800s trade arrows. The tips are made out of steel, and these things just came in by the millions. And they totally replaced the stone, which is why, other than Lewis and Clark talk about the early 1800s, talking about running into some remote tribes along one of the rivers on their journey where they were still knapping flint. Once they got to the almost reservation period, when they were really poor, indigenous people actually went back to starting to make some arrowheads and stuff. They would use glass insulators and the bottoms of bottles. It wasn't widespread, but it's just an interesting fact. So. All right, how are we doing on time? Have I bored everybody yet?
No, you're good.
You doing okay? So anyways, that's pretty much the gist of how they got populated, the tools they had, how they made them, why they used them. Did they have any fun? Did they relax? What did they do with their children? All right, miniatures. Every culture, well, I can't say every culture because I haven't seen paleos, but a lot of the collections that come in, the cultures represent some type of miniature artifact. This is a miniature stone axe. And I had a collector that collected miniature stone axes. These are actually made, they believe, just like we make everything miniature for our kids to play with and to teach them, they did the same. So when my son had a cabinet shop up in Polk, and I built display cases, and when my son was probably 3, I got him a toy hammer. And he'd go out in the shop with me and he was just pounding away. It gets them started. And I believe that they did the same thing. And you find miniatures in the Inuits up in Alaska, miniature spears, everything was made in miniature for the children. And so it's kind of fun to come across those. Smoking. Man's been smoking for a long time. This is a pipe. It's probably about 1,200 years old, and it's a stone pipe. There's just tons and tons of pipes. It's very important for religious ceremonies that they had. It's very important for healing and some of their beliefs that we believe. Some of their beliefs on the healing is passed down through the current indigenous tribes. But this is just a utilitarian, everyday corncob pipe that's made out of stone that they would have used back then. You get to the Hopewell, now they're getting elaborate. This is a Hopewell platform pipe made out of pipestone. It's highly polished, exceptionally well made, very rare, and quite often reproduced modernly. But this is a good, authentic example. So smoking played a real big part in the societies of the past. Set that there. Has anybody ever played a game called bocce? Ever heard of bocce? My grandparents moved here from Czechoslovakia. They brought bocce, and you cannot go to a family doings without playing bocce. You take this little white ball called a polino, and you throw it out there, and everyone's got a ball. You got two teams. You got 4 balls or 6 balls, and you got to roll that ball, and whoever's closest to the white ball gets a point. That's the gist of it. Okay. This is a discoidal, probably, I don't know, 1,200, 1,400 years old, okay? It's a discoidal, and forever they're trying to figure out what in the world were these things for. And anyways, they did figure it out. They had big courts in the bigger villages, like Cahokia down by St. Louis. It's basically 5 square miles, 20,000 inhabitants in this huge village farming community is like the biggest, okay? This big ball court there. And what this is this was their polino. This is what they would do is they would line up and they would have these long 6 or 8 foot spears, and they would roll this ball. And whoever got the closest to it with their spear before it stopped rolling was the winner. And just when I read that, it reminds me so much of bocce, but it's called chunky is the name of the game. It's called chunky, and they had similar games that were talked about down in Mexico, where the Aztecs or the Mayans, one of them, were playing a very similar game to that. So they did do things for entertainment, probably in periods of time when things were good. I'm sure that back in the hunter-gatherer stage, they didn't have time for games. But as it progressed and farming got going and food wasn't an everyday issue, they started finding ways to have some fun. So, questions? Anybody have any questions about anything? No? Yes, sir.
So the Talismans, the sideways one and then the perpendicular, would the same tribe use both of them, or were they distinct to specific tribes?
No, the same time period. So you're going back the same, like the Hopewell, the Hopewellian people, they had probably 15 different styles or 20 different styles of pendant, probably the same of the gorget. Some are very elaborate, some are not.
Yep.
You know, back to this banner stone, I started saying that this was used more as a presentation. You think about it, you know, I used to hunt a lot when I was younger, and I had a lot of guns. And they were my guns. I mean, I beat them into trees, banged them, dropped them, nicked them up or whatever. And then I had a gun on my wall that was, you don't shoot it. It's a presentation gun. It was given to me as a thank you gift, and it has my name on it, and it literally is there. And I think a lot of these really fancy pendants and gorgets and banner stones were a presentation at Atlatl for the man in charge, or for the neighboring tribe as a gift. They were never meant to be used, which really perplexes archaeologists, because you expect, they want to find out, how is it used? How are they using this? And I've read some really good reports on burial sites where they had found the more ceremonial styles, and they're saying, look at this is not made for use. And they've gone out and tried to use them. And it's just not functional. So why would they do something not functional It's because it's for presentation. So, but
Awesome.
anyways, any other questions?
Is there a lot of pottery found in the area? And if not, because it doesn't seem like it, but is there a reason for that?
Yes. The Woodland and the Hopewell and Indina both had pottery, more Hopewell. There's other more common pottery. We've got Ohio clay. It's very heavy. It's very wet. If you find, there's a lot of pottery that's found, especially along Lake Erie. And I'm not an expert on pottery, I'll tell you straight up, but I know a couple of guys that are. But what they're finding are shards. It's broken up because of the freezing and thawing and the weight of the mud and the rain, and it doesn't hold together. When you get pottery like this example, okay, this is from Cross County, Arkansas. All right, Arkansas, you get down on the Mississippi River and you get that sandy, loamy soil or the sandy banks, and it doesn't freeze. It stays more intact because of the environment that it's in. It doesn't get broken up. When you go out west, there's a ton of pottery. The Salado, out in the Pueblos, there's tons and tons of pottery, but it's not going into the ground. It's just laying out. It's just broken pots everywhere out there because again they don't have the precipitation problems that we have here. So to answer your question, yes, there was pottery. Was there a lot of it? I'm sure there was a good amount. It's just been ground into nothing, and that's my opinion. But I do know sites along on the reef site. One of the sites up along Lake Erie that one of the sites up along Lake Erie had a lot of pottery found. That was, I think it was a reef site, and they actually cataloged it and they dated it, and it was definitely here.
A number of years ago, there was an article in the Times Gazette about the mounds in Ashland County, but you never see anything on any of the maps about mounds in this county.
Okay, so they've been mapped, okay, and they've been documented. There's a map written by Mills. He only printed, I think, 350 copies of the book, but he documented all the mounds in Ohio. And Ashland County's got more than you would think documented on that map, in that book. I see about once a year we'll have one of those books come up for auction. And I'm always digging through it, looking, trying to where's the mounds.
Are they all on private land?
Oh, they could be anywhere. Mounds could be anywhere. They could be in a Walmart's parking lot. Because what happens is the mounds, just being facetious, what I'm saying is what happens is they just eroded. Not every mound was a huge mound. Some of them were maybe 3 feet tall, and that was it. But then not every mound was for burial either. And not every burial mound has artifacts in it. I mean, there's a lot of, why is this way and that that they're still trying to figure out. But yeah, there's a lot of mounds in Ashland County and adjoining counties. There was one in Sharon Center where I was born. It was a pretty good sized mound in the middle of the farmer's woods. But a lot of them have been plowed down. And when you get, the mounds are going to be your again, your Woodland period people, your Dinas and your Hopewell. Prior to that, it was shallow grave. There was not the big, it was pretty much shallow grave burials. And some of the books, unfortunately, it's in there, but in some of the old Ashland history books, they talk about going through the fields the first time they plowed them, and there's a lot of stuff coming up. I mean, artifacts and bones, and they're burial sites, but you can't tell they're burial sites because it was the woods that they cut all the trees down, and now, but you're going back 4,000 years. So, and again, with the ground going down, just through erosion. But yeah, there's quite a few mounds here. There's probably more mounds here than we know. So what would happen? I'll go in another different direction. Do I have time?
Yeah.
Okay. You have to realize that. Let's talk about Flint. Okay. We talk about campsites and different things that you find on your farms. Flint's not just anywhere. You can't just walk out and say, I'm going to go in my backyard, grab some flint, and make an arrowhead. You have to use flint because of a method called coil fracture, which means when I strike this with something, okay, it's going to do this and ripple, and it's going to take a flake off of it. Where if you take a rock and hit it, it's going to just chip it. You can't control it. But flint, you can control the flaking by using how you hit it, how you hold it, the pressure of your hand, and you can shape it. So you're going to percussion flake it like this with a piece of antler. Then you get back with a antler tine, and you're going to pressure flake it along the edge and take these little chips off of it all around the edges. And you're going to end up with that, but you have to have the flint. Now, in Ashland, the most prevalent flint in Ashland is Coshocton flint, and it's in other varieties from the upper Mercer vein, which are down in Coshocton County, Nellie, Church, Coshocton, or Flint Ridge flint, which is poured in Licking County. So how are they getting flint from those areas to here, and why? Well, because that's where it's at. And you're here, but you need the materials to work with. You're going to go there and make a trek for a week or so and come back with some flint. Now, while you're down there, you're not making a bunch of these while you're there and loading them up and coming back. You're down at Flint Ridge. You got about 3 days. You're making a bunch of these. This is a preform for a blank. Okay. Flint Ridge and Coshocton, but mostly Flint Ridge, has tons of impurities. And when you start working it breaks, it shatters, it's hard to chip, and you got to find the ones that. So they would sit down there and they would nap out a whole bunch of blanks, and then they would load up their satchels, and then they carted them back to Ashland. When they got back to Ashland, then they would sit there and then they'd make this finished product. Okay. These were traded a lot. Those are traded a lot. There's a lot of intertrade. Flint Ridge Flint out of Licking County, I just sold a collection that had 14 pieces that was from a site in Maryland. It was traded that heavily, especially during the Adena period. So, but you had to go to the quarry sites. Now, while you're at that quarry site, you're getting ready to come back. You're not coming back in 1 day. You might be coming back in 2 days, maybe 3 days. So you have camps along the way that you're stopping at. And what you're doing is, as you stop at that camp, you're going to leave all your axes, your big heavy tools are going to be piled against the tree, because you know that the next guys that come through are going to need them. Or when you come through again, you're going to need them. Then for some reason you abandon the camp, next thing you know, you got a farmer's field that's got 15 axes being plowed up. Okay, that's probably how they got there. At these camps, I don't think there's a lot of warfare, a lot of hatred way back when. I really don't, because of the amount of trading going on. I mean, you've got marine shell from the Gulf of Mexico in the Hopewell times over 1,000 years ago, coming all over, being found and traded into Scioto County, Ohio, Rusk County, Ohio, and being used. And you've got Flint Ridge ending up over in Maryland and tons of it in Pennsylvania. You got Carter Cave Flint from Kentucky ending up in Huron County, Ohio. All of this is trade. And I think that people were very friendly back then, and they did a lot of walkabouts. And they, hey, let's take a walk. Let's go see what's up there. Let's go see what's up north and go meet the people. But as they're at these camps are going to be probably near a spring, near water, but not in a mosquito-infested, swampy area. Probably someplace that was relatively out of the wind as much as it could be terrain-wise. And when you factor all that in, if you've got a farm that's got those areas, you're going to have a lot of artifacts. And what you're going to find, you're going to have what they call a multi-component site. You're going to have, starting at the bottom, you're going to have paleo, archaic, woodland, Adena, Hopewell, right on up to contact, because they're going to use that same site for thousands of years. Why change it? It's by a spring. It's by a river. It's got a rock bluff. Whatever the reason is, they just keep using it and using it and using it, and you end up with the same village sites and the same campsites just being used over and over and over and over and over again. You can go out in a farmer's field and you'll be walking, and you're finding flint chips everywhere. I mean, I got one site up in Polk, I go down this little rise, and I know as soon as I walk down, there's going to be 500 little Flint Ridge checks. It was a Hopewell workshop site. They're not in the camp because it's going to cut your feet all up because it's like glass. So they're going to go away from the camp somewhere, and they're going to sit there. That's where they're going to make the arrowheads and the knives. And so you know that right around there is a camp. Okay, so you walk the fields until you try and find it. So, but anyways, anyone else? Yes, ma'am.
What role did the women play? Do they know if they hunted also? Did the women help make the tools? Do they know? Or is it all men?
No. Actually, I was talking with someone about this earlier today. So there's a site down in Arkansas where they excavated a couple burials, and there were women, and by each of them, 2 different burials, by each of them was in with what they call the grave goods. They would put pottery by their heads with things that they thought they might need, and in both of these women were flint knapping toolkits. So why would you put, it's just like if my grandfather was a golfer, you want to put a golf ball in his, it's been going on forever, it always has, okay? But they would they had these flint knapping kits. So it was a lot of debate on, did some of the women actually do flint knapping? I think they did, I think they did. I think they both did, men and women, depending who had the time and who was good at it, why not? So. I have a daughter that loved to work out in the shop with me. I like it. If I was a flint napper, I had a daughter that wanted to nap flint, I'd teach her. I don't know how to, but I would have. So yes, I think that they did that. As far as some of the societies and roles were very prone to women actually being, even in the Southwest, women were landowners. I guess that was the Navajo or one of the cultures down there. They own the land. The husband is lucky to find a woman that's got, because she's a landowner. And in ancient times, there was a lot of women in very powerful positions. So, all good?
Yes, sir. Well, thank you.
All righty. It's my pleasure. Appreciate it.